Let's continue with this theme of polarization and look at how it applies to the news and information environment we live in. Because if you tell me what you drive, I can tell you where you get your news. And that wasn't always the case. Let's continue to use this framework of 40 years. I'm going to read you a few New York Times headlines from 1976. See if you can tell me what's controversial about them. Millions in taxes lost by states on military pay. U.S. plans to ask Soviets to explain its Angola policy. No-fault insurance failing to cut rates. Moscow is said to modify expectations of détente. Libya seeks role in Lebanon crisis. Court lets stand integration plan in Boston schools. So what's controversial about these headlines? Nothing. Nothing is controversial about these headlines because in 1976, there was a factual consensus. People didn't disagree on the facts underpinning the news. There were a lot of partisan discussions, a lot of differences, and a lot of debates. But fundamentally, people agreed on the facts. That made it possible for journalists to approach the news by being objective observers. And this is the traditional model of journalism that we're probably familiar with, which really was in place throughout the Cold War period, really through the end of the 20th century. It's possible to be objective when you're working in an era when people agree on the fundamental facts. So you can stand back, you can report what different sides are saying, you can balance those sides one against the other, and you can do it without really having to step in and interpret what people are saying. In 1976, that's what journalism looked like. And in 1976, we got our news from a very limited number of sources. You, if you were there, got your news perhaps from a local newspaper. Maybe you read one of the legacy magazines like Time or Newsweek. Perhaps you had a news radio station where you lived. And there were the legacy newspapers as well, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the three major networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, and perhaps public broadcasting. That was pretty much it. And they all said basically the same thing. So you could turn to Walter Cronkite or John Chancellor, for those who were old enough to know who those people were, and they would basically give you the same version of events. And as Walter Cronkite liked to say, that's the way it is. But then came cable news, and then came partisan cable news, and then talk radio, and the internet with its blogospheres, the progressive blogosphere on the left, the conservative blogosphere on the right, and then social media. And that defines our information environment today. In an environment like that, we can pick and choose the information we want to conform to our pre-existing beliefs. So we can get our news from sources that conform to our worldview. And because our worldviews are so different now, because of the polarization that's defining our time, where we get our news really determines the facts that we believe define the world. Depending on where we get our news, President Obama was either born in Hawaii or Kenya. There were either death panels in the healthcare law or there were not. The deficit has either gone way up during the present administration or it's gone down. Depending on where we get our news, that's where we get our facts. And people will swear by their understanding of events as being based in fact. Now, that creates a real problem for traditional journalists. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former senator from New York State, once famously said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts." That seems to be no longer the case. It seems that now we are entitled to our own facts. How can you go about employing the traditional model of journalism when people feel entitled to their own facts? Well, it's difficult, because if reporters want to remain true to their traditional role of passive observer, they really cannot wade into a discussion of which statements are factually true. That's not to say we don't see some of it. We do. Anyone following the election in traditional media are probably aware of sites that fact check. And so we do see some of that, perhaps as it pertains to statements made by the presidential candidates. But that's different than incorporating fact checks into story narratives. That's a much more difficult thing for journalists to do, because once they do that, they're actually stepping into this debate, this difference of perspective between the various sides, and they're playing the role of referee. Once a reporter says a particular candidate said something and it's not true, they run a number of professional risks, not the least being called partisan by people who don't agree. So they run the risk of losing audiences. They run the risk of losing access to sources. It's a problematic thing to do. The way journalists typically deal with this difficulty in an age when we have our own facts is by sidestepping the question of what is factual and simply reporting on the differences we see between people who hold different sets of facts. So basically, it comes down to side A said this, side B said that, end of story. Now, there's an irony to that, because objectivity is supposed to help us get to the truth. But if reporters feel that they're constrained from making judgments about the veracity of truth claims, then it can undermine the truth, or at least undermine our ability to understand what's true and what isn't. I can give you an example of this from a book I wrote in 2009 called Net Roots. This was during the Bush administration, when Congress was considering the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. And there was allegedly a section of this legislation that required court approval of surveillance requests coming from outside the United States. The Newsweek columnist Joe Klein took issue with this in writing, and in very strong terms. He referred to it as, quote, well beyond stupid for giving terrorists the same legal protection as Americans. Now, there was an issue with his reporting, because the thing that he claimed FISA did, it actually didn't do. And there was a lot of pushback from progressive bloggers who basically said to Joe Klein, read the legislation. If you had read the legislation, here it is, we're going to replicate it on the internet. If you read the legislation, you would understand that what you were reporting is a claim that one set of partisan interests is making about this legislation, but it's not factually true. And under pressure from bloggers, Klein actually issued an apology. He admitted that he had made a mistake, but he didn't admit to an error of fact. He admitted to an error of attribution. What he said was, my mistake was failing to say that Republicans believe the legislation can be interpreted this way, but Democrats don't. So he didn't weigh in on the fact of what the legislation said. He simply weighed in on the partisan dispute between Republicans and Democrats, and he felt that his error was not mentioning that balance in the first place. That's how difficult it is to hold to objectivity at a time when we don't agree on the facts. Now, objectivity is not an absolute. It's not the only basis for understanding what's going on in the world. In fact, objectivity is really a value. It's a value. It may form the structure for conventional reporting, but it is a value. There are other values. There are other ways of understanding the world. Transparency is a value. It's a different value. To know where people are coming from, that's also a value. And it is a value that describes the information we get on the web. Transparency. Internet writing is totally different from conventional reporting, in that on the internet, writers don't need to pretend not to have a point of view. Quite the opposite. The best internet writing has a point of view. That's what makes it interesting. So if we look at reporting or news dissemination on the internet, and we think of it in these terms as transparent, we actually have something, a way of providing information that's a very good fit to the age we live in. Transparency is a very good fit to a highly divided partisan era. In fact, it's much more typical of the way people got information for most of our country's history. Actually, the period of Cold War consensus that exemplified what happened in 1976, that's really the anomaly. If we go back to the early days of the Republic, there was no commercial press. There was no neutral arbiter. Objectivity wasn't valued. The press was partisan. And political parties would publish newspapers for the faithful, and people would buy them and read them knowing exactly what they were getting. And they were filled with allegations and mistruths, much like what we see today on the internet. But people knew where they were coming from. It was transparent. And so people were able to interpret and decipher what they were getting. It's possible for us to get information that is blatantly partisan and still make sense of it. So I guess there's good news and bad news in all of this, or maybe I would say there's encouraging news and challenging news. Let's put it that way. The encouraging news is that the internet really gives us everything we need to know about what's going on in the world. We have more information at our fingertips than at any time in human history. Google is a verb, right? Right? You're probably Googling objectivity right now, right? Because who needs to wait? It's there. That's the opportunity. The challenge is making sense of it all, right? I mean, we can think of the internet as a river. We can think of it as a flowing river with a lot of backwater, a lot of stagnant pools. The part of the river that's moving quickly, that's cleansing. Think about what the internet allows us to do. We can be gatekeepers. Any one of us can be gatekeepers. Any one of us can contribute to conversations, contribute to information in real time, shaping debate. If we think of internet from the standpoint of open source, where a lot of individuals contributing what they know or what they see in real time can help shape a discussion, and if enough people are contributing, actually erroneous material will get pushed to the side. That's the fast-flowing, cleansing water of the internet. And we do see this coming from the internet. When the progressive netroots questioned Joe Klein on FISA, that's a perfect example of this. How individuals operating as their own gatekeepers changed the story and brought to light something that otherwise would not have been visible. But of course, there are backwaters, right? Which is why I always say, of course it's true. I read it on the internet. You know, the internet is also filled with conspiracy theories. It's filled with all kinds of misinformation. So here's the challenge. The challenge is to be able to figure out what to accept and what to discard. That's really the challenge for our generation. To question, to interpret, to be active participants in our civic life. And this is so different from what we saw during the era of television. It's so different. Television is a passive medium. Television washes over us. You know, you can watch television, you know, with one hand on the remote control and the other in a bag of chips, right? We don't have to do anything. That's part of its appeal. But the internet isn't like that. The internet is a hot medium. The internet engages us. It asks us to be engaged. It's why sometimes we feel put off when someone sends us a text in all caps. You feel like you say, stop yelling at me. They're not yelling at you, they're typing in caps. It feels like they're yelling at you because of the way we engage on the internet. And that's basically what defines our era. We have the opportunity to be our own gatekeepers, but we have to do it wisely, which means that we need to engage if we're going to be able to do it wisely. And I know this sounds incongruent with living in an era where so many of us prefer reality TV to reality because reality is so hard. And it is. It's hard to live in a polarized era. It's very difficult. But, you know, democracy isn't meant to be a spectator sport. And I think it became a spectator sport in the age of television. We're moving away from that now in the age of the internet. So the internet provides us with a means for self-education, for expression, and for engagement. But we have to use it well. That's the great challenge of our era, and it's also the great opportunity.